Introduce our filmmakers. So we have Roman here, Tyler, and Evan in the back, who came in from New York last night, and they're here to film the class. We did a little interview portion before, so they're interested in your thoughts on Nightmare on Elm Street 2. There's going to be a little bit of weirdness. I'm going to be moving back and forth between the lectern and this spot, but any questions before we start? Okay, so you guys looked at Nightmare on Elm Street, and this is the only film we're doing in which it is a sequel. So you guys tell me, you are deeply embedded in franchises, in multiplicities, sequels. What's the sequel for? Yeah, Charlie.
Cash grab.
Okay, so purely economic motives, let's say, that the sequel is there to capitalize on your intended nostalgia of a product. It has a certain pre-sold audience. Okay, so beyond the economic imperative, what should sequels do? Yeah.
Perhaps this could be a way to explore different ideas that the original couldn't tackle.
Good, yeah, so we can think about the sequel as expansion. We have a narrative world set in motion in Nightmare on Elm Street, and we're gonna explore the narrative world of Nightmare on Elm Street. What things are true in this world? What other stories can we tell? That's part of what the sequel's doing. Yeah.
At the same time, like besides like exploring the same world, you also want to like reinvent the
Yes.
world. Not like the world, but like what you're doing inside the film.
Yeah, so you guys tell me as spectators, you're gonna go see Avatar 2, for instance. What are your expectations? Do you want the same film? Do you want something completely innovative? What balance do you expect as a consumer? Yeah, Daisy?
Well, there has to be the spectacle.
Okay. So you were seeing that as an essential part of the Avatar world, for instance. Okay, good. Charlie?
Something that definitely expands on the whole, maybe the whole world, because in
Okay.
Avatar 1, they just did Pandora.
Uh-huh.
So maybe exploring like the oceans,
Okay.
which he actually is trying to do. And maybe also to expand the action, like have a lot more action.
Okay.
Like, since they have the characters right off the bat, just jump right into the action.
Okay, so I want to hit on this idea some more. So you're saying expand the story world, but you're also saying more of the same, right? And I want to see if other people agree. Yes.
I would expect to see things that are easily recognizable
Okay.
from the original.
Why is that pleasurable to you?
I guess it's become sort of a continuation in that
Okay.
aspect. I guess you get that pleasure from being able to recognize things that you've seen before,
Yeah.
but also having a new outlook on it.
I like this. Yeah. Yeah. Go ahead.
I think it's a lot like you said, that sequels are a lot for people who are already devoted to the fan base, and
Good.
they go and they don't want to see something completely new because they're already attached to the first one and want to see that again.
Good. Absolutely. So you're speaking to consumers of the original text who want to see the same, but with variation, but with expansion. I like this. Yeah. Go ahead.
I was just gonna say something similar, that I feel like people go to see sequels for the same reason they go to see like a literary adaptation, because they're already invested in how they imagine this world, and
Okay.
I think that they want the gratification of seeing what they imagine on screen, but obviously that's not possible.
Absolutely. I guess so. I like this idea of a fan investment in a text, and you want. I like the word gratification too. That you want to be gratified for your investment in the original product. Macy?
How about we talk about a sequel that delivered none of those things? Is
Okay.
anyone here familiar with Exorcist 2?
Okay. Yeah. So this is a good question. When and how does a sequel fail, and how do we determine that? Why did Exorcist 2 fail in your determination?
Because it basically delivered the exact opposite of the original and was also batshit insane.
Okay, so
Sorry.
so it swapped aesthetics for one thing. It wanted to do an art film, right? In a world, the Exorcist world, that doesn't call out to be an art film, at least for its consumers. And you're saying it inverted expectations of the original, and it didn't seem part of the same story world. Am I being fair to your statement?
The director also supposedly hated the original. He thought
Yeah.
it was child torture.
So, all right, so it's this idea of a filmmaker making an aggressive anti-sequel in many ways. Yeah, Chris?
It would also not work if it's not like bigger and better. Like especially like you think like Godfather 2 stepped up the game, Aliens stepped up the game, anything, and then like things like you see like Scream 2, like Scream 2 took it a step back.
Okay.
And just didn't do as much as like the first film does.
That's interesting, as Scream 2 espoused what makes a good sequel. It's within the diegesis of the film, right?
Exactly.
And I want to show a clip from that. Charlie?
But the thing with the other problem with the sequels is like, oh, we did like say Spider-Man's, the Sam Raimi ones. They kept getting bigger. It's like, oh, we need a bigger one, and that's when they went to Spider-Man 3. More villains, more of the same, and then it failed because they had like too much. There's so little time to have multiple enemies. And then that's why the Amazing Spider-Man 2 failed, because they did more of the same.
Do you get turned off as a spectator when something feels like a cash grab? And then how do you know that it feels like a cash grab rather than a legitimate extension of the story world? Yeah.
I would say it would feel like a cash grab if it was pretty much the same movie with some variations like The Hangover Part 2. It's literally the same movie as the prior, so it can't help but feel it's a cash grab. And if you look at the critical reception, it reflects that, and every critique I've read says it's just the same movie again.
Good, I like this. I like this thinking about when do we get turned off by a sequel. Yeah.
Not just like specific movies, but certain directors. Like I always think Michael Bay just puts out the same crap every time. Like
so would you say like the Transformers sequels feel like cash
that
grabs?
movie he made was basically Transformers for like the Navy and.
So what's the tipping point for you when something feels like a legitimate, like a slasher formula repeated several times versus you're making the exact same movie? Do you have a sense of like what's the difference between those things?
I'd say the direction the character's taken. If you expand the characters, expand the storyline, then it's, beneficial. But if you just having the same, mellow, like the same tone throughout all the movies, I don't think it's really growing.
And I think what you're getting to is maybe the distinction between what feels like a sequel versus what feels like a remake, right? To simply tell the same story with a different set of actors is not a sequel, but a remake. Daisy, and then we'll go down here, Charlie.
Yeah, but what about letting you take something like I don't know, the new Star Wars movie, which was very well received, and I loved it too, but it also kills off a very beloved character from the series. So.
Sure. Although I said several heavy critiques lofted against the reboot in that it was the same movie, or the same franchise, right? Okay, this is great conversation, but Charlie, I said I'm going to get to you. Yeah, go ahead.
Like 2 points. One, I think the idea of like the slasher stuff is like the Saw movies, they're pretty much same formula, and then the paranormals.
Yeah.
But in the case of the sequel having more of the same, I think that's what's probably going to set Deadpool 2 apart from the sequels, is because they say, oh, we did well in the first one, made a lot of money, and let's expand the world. That's not their thinking in this one. They said more of the same, but it's like different like characters, but it's like a building block steps.
Okay. All right, so all these things, I'm going to move on. Sorry, Chris, I'll get back to you. All this we're going to think about when we get to the film for today. So people have said that the remake, the heart of the remake, is a desire to never see the story end, right? To keep expanding this world in which we exist, in which fans love, as opposed to the sequel, is a desire to tell the same story over and over again in different ways, in different times, in different countries, right? And so what we're talking about, the distinction between the remake and the sequel, is a sort of revision, I think it's the word, a refashioning, versus extension. And this is the grounding theory of the sequel, is to extend pleasure, extend the story world. All right, so given everything you guys have said, after the film, I'd like you to ask you, to what degree is Nightmare on Elm Street 2 this type of sequel, an extension of the story world that balances reiteration and innovation? All right, so I'm going to play this clip from Scream 2, has already kind of been mentioned, which lays out, at least for Wes Craven, the rules of the sequel after this commercial. All right, never mind. 22 seconds, way too long. All right, so let's kind of move in. So what do you guys remember about the slasher film? What are the rules of the slasher? He was going to lay it out first, but I think you guys can do just as well. Charlie, what's a feature of the slasher?
The final girl.
Hey, the final girl. Who's the final girl? Yes, sir. I know you know, though. What's the final girl? Yeah.
Most of the time it's like the more innocent one that's kind of on the borderline of her virginity and her adolescence.
Absolutely. So we know that Nancy is on the cusp of virginity. In many ways, Nightmare on Elm Street 2 is about her protecting her virginity against this marauder, making sure she doesn't go to sleep, making sure she's vigilant against protecting her virginity. Yes, Wayne?
She's always very aware.
Good.
And like at the beginning, it seems like she's the only one that's aware.
Good. I like that. And do you guys remember the quote that you guys read about transferring Lila Crane from Psycho to the modern slasher? What do we do to Lila Crane to make her a modern final girl in the slasher cycle? What changes? Yeah.
assume the role of Arbogast as well as an investigator?
Good, absolutely. So she becomes this amalgam. She's not just the victim, but she's also the victim combined with Arbogast, the investigator from Psycho, combined with Sam, the rescuer from Psycho, right? She becomes an amalgam of all those characters. Good. So Carol Clover outlined these features of the slasher: the killer, the terrible place, that is the not home, weapons that are phallic in nature, right? Not guns. Slashers don't use guns. Victims, which we've already talked about, and the final girl, who is unlike, in a very distinctive way, the other victims. One of the other things Carol Clover talks about is that the final girl is sexually repressed, much like the killer that pursues her. And in that way, they're quite similar, right? Now, which of these does Nightmare on Elm Street play with, if any of them? Yeah, Chris?
I mean, it definitely works with, like, weapons.
Yes.
And the idea of, like, it's very, like, phallic imagery there.
Yeah.
I mean, you have, like, the knives on the hand.
Good.
I mean, there's 4 of them, too.
Absolutely. And he's not a human being, right, wielding a knife. He is, in many ways, a beast. He has claws. Yeah, go ahead, Andy.
Terrible Place is not an actual place. It's like a different kind of like dimension or reality.
Good.
Like the dream world or whatever.
Absolutely. So I think this is probably the most important change that Nightmare on Elm Street does, is that it makes the terrible place inside one's mind, right? Where you are victimized, but you also, if able to tap into it, have a modicum of power, right? Good.
I was going to go off that way. The terrible place is sleep, and that's someone that everyone can relate to. Everyone sleeps, and it's supposed to be a place of security and comfort.
Good.
So when you make that a terrifying place, it kind of hits home.
Good. And what else about sleep? Can you avoid that state? No. Eventually you have to succumb to it, right? You can avoid the terrible place. You can choose not to go to that god-awful house in Texas Chainsaw Massacre, right? But you cannot avoid this terrible place. Yeah.
Well, added on the terrible place, it's the place where Freddy Krueger went to sleep because he was killed. So since that, he's trying to repress that memory into the kids, so the parents that had something to do with his killing.
Good.
So it's all just a whole, like, that they think it's a dream, but it's really Freddy's reality.
Okay, good. And another distinctive feature is the breakdown between reality and fantasy space, right? Protagonists within this film cannot make that distinction between terrible place and reality. You got a thought? Yeah.
I haven't seen the movie all the way through yet, but could you say that the final girl is like altered by making it a guy? Because is Jesse like the final?
That is a question I want to ask. What happens if and when we have a final boy? Absolutely. Keep that in mind. JC?
I'm not sure this is related to any of those so-called features or not, but am I the one who finds Freddy more campy than scary?
I think you're right. Absolutely. He speaks, right? Which sets him apart from most slashers. And he's funny. He is a source of humor in the text, especially as the franchise goes on, when they get more campy. So very unusual in that regard. Good. Yeah.
There's also like more backstory to the killer.
Yes.
I feel like that's something that creates a bit more of a psychological terror. Is that you know why and how he's doing everything.
Good. I like this, Brooke. Yeah, Chris.
But I almost disagree with that because I don't feel like there's any more than like Jason or like, because you still know like Mrs. Voorhees was killed in front of him and like that's how he became like
what
Jason. So like I feel like there is like always this like terrible thing that happens to the killer.
Yeah.
And I don't really feel like Nightmare on Elm Street really sets itself apart too much from that.
People call this the wound that creates the villain. That they all have a site of trauma which creates them. Good. All right, so this is good stuff and kind of setting the tone for the slasher. I'll skip that. What's interesting to me is that when we get to Nightmare on Elm Street 2, it is going to become a horror amalgam. It's going to be hybridized. It's going to be crossed with another genre. And I think most significantly, this film gets crossed with the teen pick in a way that wasn't quite present in the first one. Nancy is dating. She's having these sort of first dalliances with boys. But this is going to cross over with a sort of Hughesian world. Does anyone know John Hughes? What are some other John Hughes films? Yes, sir.
Ferris Bueller's Day Off.
Good.
Breakfast Club.
Good. Any 16 Candles. Right. So this is the 1980s world of John Hughes. And I would argue, has anyone seen Pretty in Pink? All right. So I'm going to argue that Jesse in this film is Ducky. From Pretty in Pink. He is the nerdy boy who can't get a girl, and yet he meets this popular girl, and it's this sort of coming of age through this. And there's a sort of Molly Ringwald, popular girl. All right, so what happens then? We'll think about when we get to the end of the film. What happens when this horror picture overlays with the teen coming-of-age romance? All right, one of the things to think about in this film, we've talked about bedrooms before in context of this film, in King Kong. In the horror film, what does the bedroom usually represent? Yes, sir. Safety, good. What else? Yeah.
Sex.
Sex. Why sex? If I think back to King Kong's hand entering that window. Yeah.
It's like the beast in the boudoir.
Yeah. So we talked about with King Kong, the beast in the boudoir, and I think we still have that, certainly in the Nightmare on Elm Street films, where the bedroom as a site invasion is always sexualized. It's always about sex. What's interesting is that you'll see in this film that Jesse has this kind of, we could say queer, or we could say not hegemonically masculine dance performance, and so which gets interrupted, and he's embarrassed by it. So in this film, you can think about the bedroom as this safe space or site of experimentation, and I think that's important to take with us if we read this as a queer film. The other interesting feature of this film, and where it gets kind of intertextual, is that as opposed to the first film in the franchise, this is a protagonist monster film in the vein of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Psycho. And there's moments of this film when we get to the locker room where you see him kind of in a way exercise this power against an aggressor that feels in many ways like Carrie White from the De Palma film Carrie. So think about these sort of deep intertextuality of this film too, the monster that emerges when aroused. And this is owing directly to Psycho. All right, so keep that in mind, the protagonist monster. Like in the first, we have this idea of falling asleep as the release of repression, and with the release of repression comes monsters. And this is how Nightmare on Elm Street is using this conceit of sleep, the danger of sleep, the danger of not being vigilant. I'm going to argue that we have a different take on what sleep represents in these two pictures. For the first film, Nancy falling asleep means that she's not vigilant against protecting her virginity. If we think about all the ways in which violence in the first film is so sexualized. So to go to sleep means penetration, rape, loss of virginity. In this film, the sleep in the sort of death of repression equals the emergence of the queer monster or the queer self. All right. So talk a little bit, your reading for today talked about connotation versus denotation in representations of queerness. Who remembers the distinction between these two? What's denotative? Yeah.
Well, I mean, was connotation like this, like the hints here and there within the movie that's kind of, maybe you can kind of sort of imply that the guy is sort of, yeah, the main character or the characters in the movie are like sort of gay, queer, all that stuff.
Right.
I guess denotation is like not really mentioned. It's like you gotta think about
You're close. You're on the right track. So connotation is the kind of wink and the suggestion and the coding, we could say. Denotation is, we're going to name it as such. We're going to call this is a gay character, right? And there's a regime of connotation when it comes to queerness, because as I'm sure you guys know, there was a production code in place in the 1930s up until 1968 where you literally couldn't say the word gay. And the production code, they gave them the authority to actually change characters completely. So you had to rely on a regime of connotation, winking, symbolism in films in order to tell your audience, and if you were queer, you got kind of used to the codes as you watch films. You know that this means that. So I'm going to show you a clip from an early film that uses connotation, and I think in a way that's relevant to our discussion here. That's Maltese Falcon from the 40s. So they're going to have a character, Peter Lorre plays, who in the novel this is based on, they describe him as this guy's queer. But in the movie world, in Hollywood, you can't say that. And so they rely on visual cues. I'd like you to pay attention to characterization, music, props, and actor movement to look at the way in which they are coding this character as queer.
To be on the safe side. Okay, go ahead.
Gardenia.
Quick, darling, in with it.
We know Peter Lorre's gay in The Maltese Falcon, and even before we see him, we're told that there's a man outside wearing perfume, gardenia. And then we also hear some kind of funny, slightly oriental, feminine music.
You sit down, Mr. Carroll.
Thank you, sir. The original novel didn't mince words about Peter Lorre's character. It read, "This guy is queer."
We have strange offer condolences for your partner's unfortunate death.
The movie could only hint, broadly.
See, Mr. Spade, I'm trying to recover ornament that, shall we say, has been mislaid.
Uh-huh.
I thought and hoped you could assist me. The ornament is a statuette. Black figure of a bird.
All right. So similarly, and this continues. I mean, in the 1980s, we have a very homophobic turn in Hollywood, which I'll talk about in a bit. But we have a very similar kind of regime of connotation, especially phallic imagery, which is one thing I really want you guys to pay attention to in the film, how the film employs phallic imagery in an almost juvenile way to suggest queerness. And as you're watching, think about yourself potentially as a spectator in the 1980s. Think about yourself as a straight spectator, a gay spectator. Do you think you would pick up on the codes? How heavily coded is this film? How winky is this film to you, the audience? And it's really interesting, certain lines take on a whole different sort of regime of connotation. This 1-2, Freddy's coming for you, becomes kind of filthy in a way in this film, as it's kind of reiterated over and over again, as this film is about Freddy emerging when his character feels queer desire. So, you guys read this article for today. You read both In Dread of Difference and the PDF that I gave you. So you tell me, Harry Benshoff, what does he say about the homosexual as monster in a horror film? How does it emerge? In what ways? Charlie.
I think one, it says like, I kept reading the text about the 3 ways it shows up in the movie. Like one was the main protagonist or that are officially gay, feminine. That I think 2 was the main villain was that, and then 3 was the connotation, denotation, and this the keywords there.
Good, absolutely. Good. What else do you remember? Let's tease out some of those ways in which the homosexual gets represented as a threat. Cheyenne.
When it says that Jesse attempts to become intimate with Lisa at her pool party, Freddy intervenes by causing Jesse's tongue to become grotesquely elongated. And then Jesse flees to Grady's bedroom and says that he fears that something is trying to get inside his body.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a key way. The idea of homosexual desire as an interruption of heterosexuality, I think, is key for how we think about this. If you've ever seen Bride of Frankenstein, the queer villain of Bride of Frankenstein keeps luring Dr. Frankenstein away from his matrimonial bed, right? This idea of interrupting heterosexuality. Good. How else? Yeah, Andy?
There's also, in a way, kind of like phallic imagery. Good. Like Count Dracula is considered to be like this handsome, kind of mysterious being. But he's able to, both, I guess, in a way, metaphorically have sex with men and women by transporting his fluids with their blood.
Yeah, so the pansexuality of the vampire. Good. What else about the vampire becomes a sort of queer horror character? Charlie, go ahead.
That, I think this is near when the time AIDS was starting to come out, so it was like an STD. However, when the vampire bit you, he was turning you into like death.
Yes.
So it's like the idea of the sucking the life out of you, but also giving you a disease at the same time.
Absolutely. And we're thinking about this in the context of the 80s, paranoia around AIDS. Suddenly, the vampire film reemerges. Is that an accident? No. Right? It's all about AIDS paranoia. And the homosexual as monster becomes a carrier of pathogen, a diseased object. Absolutely. What else? Charlie?
Well, maybe the fear that the homosexual is like the monster could maybe be the idea of rape, violence,
sexual violation,
that kind of
Absolutely.
Stuff. Is the idea of another way they can represent the monster.
Absolutely, and we're talking here about the demonization of queerness. So queerness often linked to sadism, violence, often pedophilia. So all these ideas of the homosexual as predator come out in horror narratives. Good. We hit on almost all of them. The one thing that I think we forget is this idea of the monster within us, right? And I think this is especially pertinent for the film today. We heard this term, the monster from the id, before. So the idea that there is a creature inside us that can erupt, right? You remember this? Creatures from the id, the danger? Yeah, good. All right, so the monster and the homosexual, 4 variations on this. And in this film, we see a pretty intense link between queerness and sadomasochistic violence, owing to the sort of homophobia of the period. This, we'll see when you guys watch, this is a dual sort of representation here. We have the predatory coach, so homosexual as predator represented here, while we have linking sadism and violence in the eruption of the homosexual from within to attack the predator. And if you watch this scene, I'd like you guys to pay attention to Jesse, this actor's face. Very much like Carrie White, who seems to have a bit of pleasure in the eruption of queerness from him, which attacks this predator. Yeah.
I read an article that was like arguing that this scene was about like when Jesse fell asleep and Freddie couldn't completely control him at the time. So this is like Jesse's dreaming about like going to the bar and like going to the showers with the coach, but then Freddie like takes it to the dark place.
Yeah. So it transforms his fantasy, his queer fantasy, into like a queer nightmare in some ways. I like this. Yeah. I think this is, the key point of this film. I think it's very complicated, especially when we think about, is this a homoerotic film or is it a homophobic film? Colton?
As far as queerness is violence,
yeah.
I also read an article for my final paper.
You guys are awesome. Tell me more.
And basically was saying how the cross-genderedness or the confusion over your sexuality or your gender, these like serial killers or stuff like that usually lash out in violence because they're so confused.
Good.
They use like Psycho, for example, also Silence of the Lambs.
Yes, which we'll get to. And so there's another sort of gender dysphoria as psychosis character, right? Which much lash out against others because of their own sort of gender dysphoria. Yeah.
Just in terms of this film in the 80s, it makes me think of, there's a fear because if you think of like the Kinsey scale that says it's not as simple as people are gay or straight, it's how gay are you?
Good.
And people could say, oh, so what if like maybe I'm gay and I don't even know it, and they don't want that.
And we're going to talk about how this film wasn't a success, and maybe that's the terror of this film, why it wasn't an immediate success, is that it hit a little bit too hard to home, right? Thinking about the Kinseyness of sexuality is, I think, a very aggressive thought for, we would say, our nominally heterosexual male viewers. Good. All right, so the broad way we can think about queerness and the horror film is back to this idea of binaries, right? And I brought this up with King Kong. If we look at, I think the best way to read an ideology of the film is to say, what is the villain? What qualities do they possess? And therefore, what does this film validate? And generally speaking, in the horror narrative, queerness tends to align along these sort of categories to the right, whereas normative culture, validated culture, tends to be aligned with these qualities to the left. So whereas queer culture, queer characters are polluted, that means normative culture is clean. Where queer villains have alternative social structures, we validate, therefore, the nuclear family structure. Whereas queer characters tend to be migratory or nomadic. The good, the validated in horror films which employ queerness are rooted. They are stable. They form family structures. Queer characters are hedonistic. The normative is controlled. I'll get to you in a second, Charlie. So we think about the emergence of the vampire again in the 1990s amid AIDS phobia. Certainly we have the danger of hedonism, right? The queer character is future destroying. The characters who deserve to live are reproductive. And this is true of the the gay male-directed Frankenstein from the 30s, in which all of the characters who can't reproduce in the film, they say, we deserve to die. And the characters who can reproduce are able to survive. And finally, in this sort of midst of contagion anxiety, queerness is contagious, not just in terms of vector, in terms of disease, but the idea that you can spread queerness to others, which is the root of the vampire story, is that you pull others into your hedonistic sex polymorphousness. Whereas the normative culture, validated culture, is contained. Okay, if we think, Colton, and then Charlie.
Some of the words that you used up creature from another world.
Yeah, tell
how
me.
People used to think about communism, and it makes me think that America as a culture or whatever needed another scapegoat after the Cold War.
And I want us to think, there's a writer who says that monsters are meaning machines, meaning that they don't just signify one thing, they signify many things that we layer on top of each other. So I think the thing for another world is simultaneously about communism, but it's in a way about queerness or anxious about things that don't reproduce. And I don't think it's an accident that Dr. Carrington feels very queer, right? He seems obsessed with these things that don't reproduce because we're given a sense that he probably doesn't reproduce either, right, as a queer character. Yeah, Sean?
I just find the words reproductive and feature destroying kind of ironic in the case of Nightmare on Elm Street, because either way, Freddy wants you to be reproductive and he wants you that so he can just come out. So I guess that in a sense they're kind of contradictory of each other in the sense of, in the case of Nightmare on Elm Street.
Right, and if we think about sort of linking queerness to AIDS anxiety, what is more future destroying than an AIDS virus, right? It literally kills its host. And that becomes commensurate with queerness. And I'll give you a very modern example of how this is employed. Right? Think about it, if you've seen these. We know that they are good guys because they form families, right? They are not nomadic. They're stable, they form families, form forever families, they call them. They play baseball, right? They're good, reproductive, nice American folks who don't want to kill other people. The queer villains are nomadic, not white. I think that's one thing to kind of point out, or not uniformly white. They will kill other people. They don't play baseball, right? They're not good American citizens. They're not good reproductive, stable American citizens. They roam the countryside and do terrible things. And so, while not denotatively queer, this film employs a kind of regime of connotation of queerness to characterize its villain as not good American citizens. All right, so we can see this queerness being deployed in non-literal ways, but in a much more literal way in Nightmare on Elm Street 2. All right, so if this is an extension of a story world, what is true in the world of Nightmare on Elm Street? What things happen? What characters exist? What is the world of Nightmare on Elm Street? Yeah.
Well, Freddy.
Okay, which is what?
He's the monsters from the first one. So
okay.
The fact that he reappears again and again kind of leads to sort of the continuality of it.
Okay, good. What else? Yes, sir.
The fact that he appears in the same state that people are sleeping.
Good. So the danger of sleep, I think, is part of the world of Nightmare on Elm Street. What else? Yes.
You say like the location. I'm not 100% sure the second one takes place on Elm Street, but I know the first one and the remake both take place on Elm Street.
So define that world for me. What is Elm Street as opposed?
It's like the typical like suburban neighborhood.
Good. Suburban white neighborhood, right? All right. Good. Yeah.
They kind of. Sorry.
Go ahead. We'll go and then Carl.
Okay. They kind of like expanded a little bit by having Freddy still invade the dreams, but instead of like him doing it, he possesses Jesse instead.
Good, I like this. Yeah. Good. And we could put these two together to say that it is a world in which you can lose control of your body, right? Fair? Yeah, Carlton?
The adolescent victims.
Good, absolutely. It is this sort of coming of age narrative, and coming of age is bloody and violent. Good. Yeah, Ryan?
The authority figures or like the adults are not really trustworthy.
Good, absolutely. Complacent or impotent authority figures. Good. What else? Yeah.
The history of the area should probably stay the same. So the parents did something terrible to this man who's coming back to punish their children.
Awesome. Yeah, I think you guys hit on all the ones that I thought about or I think important. One, this is a world in which youth must pay for the mistakes of their parents. And this is true of this film. This is true of something like Nightmare on Elm Street, in which the parents of the young people displace this working class farm family, right? And if we think about this in the 1980s, this is a world of youth sort of inheriting a Cold War culture, right, from their parents, and they're having to pay for those mistakes. All right, absolutely. Sleep releases repression, invites monsters. This is the world of Nightmare on Elm Street, in which you must be vigilant, but of course it's futile because you can't avoid sleep. kind of hit around this, but I think it's really important to note that the violence in this film, in this franchise, is sexual violence. The primary mode of violence in this film is signified rape. And in a way, the invasion of the bedroom, King Kong's hand going through the bedroom, has always been kind of metaphorical rape. With the 1980s, the release of some of these strictures, the rise of the code, the rating system, it allows for a more denotative representation of this as sexual violence. Another popular horror genre of this period was the rape revenge film. So this is the 1980s, where they're naming what has always been connotatively rape as real rape. This we didn't hit on quite much, but I think this is a really odd feature of this franchise as opposed to its brothers and sisters in the slasher genre, is the male body, which is frequently exposed. And the female body tends to be quite clothed. If you remember in the first film, Nancy, who lives in California, and she's wearing a sweater and then puts a hoodie on and goes outside. She's constantly obliterating the female form in this franchise, whereas the male body becomes quite exposed and eroticized. What do you think about that? All right. And finally, this is a coming of age narrative. In the first film, moving into adulthood is violent, sexual, and bloody. In this, I would call it a coming out of age narrative. So this sort of revision of Pretty in Pink from Ducky's perspective, where the movement into queer adulthood, however, is imperiled by disease, contagion, and sadism, something to be avoided at all costs. Yes, sir?
And also the coming of age, maybe like would be the fact of them experiencing women reproduction for the first time,
Absolutely.
which is really if they do it, it's their downfall. So it's like a prevention kind of term of movie.
Okay, yeah, so you're seeing this as almost like a moral education?
You could say that.
Okay, interesting.
In a really messed up way.
Right. All right, so just the context for the AIDS phobia of this film. In the context of this film's release, we would still be talking about 81. We would call this gay-related immune deficiency, so it was seen as a subcultural disease, and therefore the president at the time wouldn't even utter the word AIDS for a decade and a half. As it was seen as this sort of triage mentality, that this is a subset of the community that ostensibly let themselves die out. So it was changed to AIDS in 82 when discovered that 50% of infection rates were actually heterosexual. But this notion of gay men as primary vector, patient zero, colored how we talked about queerness in the 1980s, where horror film in a way gave us a vocabulary to talk about actual homosexuals as vampires, as diseased pariahs, those sorts of things. So remember the relationship between horror film and reality is reciprocal. That horror films do reflect culture, but they also give us a vocabulary to talk about things in the real world. Lucy Fisher called this, horror films are an allegory of the real. All right. I didn't pull too much background on this film, but I do think this quote is interesting because I think it gets to the heart of how you guys want to interpret this film. Is it homoerotic or is it homophobic? And this whole sort of thorny issue of intention, which we've talked about quite a bit. But this is what the screenwriter had to say. Yes, there was certainly some intentional subtext, but it was intended to play as homophobic rather than homoerotic. I thought about the demographics for these types of films, young heterosexual males, and tried to imagine what kinds of things would frighten them to the core. And scary dreams that make them, even momentarily, question their own sexuality seem like a slam dunk to me. All right, so if you need that layer of intention to read this as a queer film, here you go, right? So direct from the screenwriter's mind. So I want you guys to be thinking about, not is this a queer film? We're going to kind of take that as axiomatic and just say, what is this film doing with queerness? How is it being represented in this film? Yeah, Chris?
Side note, like going back one slide to the idea of grid.
Yeah.
I think it was 1981, 1982 that Tron came out, and where it takes place on the grid.
Oh, interesting.
Do you think that, maybe possibly have some kind of affiliation?
I mean, that's interesting. It's, I'll date myself, and I have to say, I saw that in theaters. So I haven't really thought about that movie in a long time, but it makes me want to go back and watch it. That's interesting. Good stuff. Okay, so here's the question though, and the filmmakers who are here today are looking at how queer audiences have actually embraced this film, which is interesting. If we take this screenwriter's sort of writing as gospel that he intended to write a homophobic film, what does that say about queer audiences who embrace this film? Are they just dupes? How do we feel about this? How can you embrace something that is directly antithetical to you? Yeah.
Well, I think it's like a point of identification.
Okay.
Because like the world is like dominantly not accepting of it at times. So like I think that's a point of identification.
Okay, so you can identify with the film. Does that make you self-hating if you identify with this film that was intended to be homophobic? Yeah.
It kind of confirms your existence.
Okay.
Like a lot of people just kind of try to not think about like the gay community and like the idea that they made a movie that directly, like I don't know, not directly but indirectly like references all these gay communities. And
Yeah.
It's like they're basically connecting with the film because of that reason.
Yeah, and so what we're talking about is a complete vacuum of representation, right? And so we're seeing spectators who maybe have never seen themselves represented on screen, even potentially in a negative way. You'll see a sequence in this film that happens in a gay bar, and I'll say that was the first time I'd ever seen a gay bar before. There's also one in Police Academy. I remember that pretty distinctly. But they were in both films, they were definitely places you didn't want to be. But I remember watching and going, oh my God, I think that's a gay bar. Daisy?
Is it actually homophobic, or is it just playing around, I guess, would be one way to...
This is a good question. So this could be the take where you say, look, they're not total dupes. There is pleasure to be found in this film. Or maybe you read things as ironically or campy, and you're finding pleasure in them. Yeah, right?
I feel like men watching this movie, or any like people watching this movie, it just represents like what they go through.
Good.
So like going back to the importance of representation.
Good, I like this. So the slide I have up here is that there are different ways we can think about spectatorship. And let's say, if you remember this first article that we read, a film is not a telegram. Do you guys remember this, right? So you, screenwriter, can encode a homophobic film. Does that mean that's the way I decode it? Not necessarily. So we can think about that readings can be dominant. That is, I also read this as a homophobic film. I'm going to take that ideology wholesale. Readings can be negotiated. I accept certain things. I do not accept other things of the ideology of this film. Or readings can be oppositional. I find pleasure where it's not warranted or not authorized. Yeah?
And M. Night Shyamalan's most recent work then for that last one.
Good. Do you want to say a word about this?
Well, M. Night Shyamalan, didn't, I think, intend for us to find pleasure in making fun of After Earth, for instance.
Okay.
So.
So I think this is camp viewing, right? To watch something and to laugh at it, even though it wasn't intended to be funny, that's oppositional viewing right there. And we do that all the time. Yeah, Charlie?
Well, that's the same could be same for those samurai cop movies.
Okay.
They're like really, really, really bad, but they're good at the same time.
Yeah.
By the fact that they're made to be made fun of, and then that's in the case of Tommy Wiseau's The Room, that is not. It's supposed to be a drama, but people laugh out loud. Like it's like such a bad movie. So it's just the reaction of it.
Okay, and so if we're thinking about queer spectators, is oppositional reading maybe a primary feature of queer spectatorship? People who don't see themselves represented on scene, who don't see their stories on screen. One could argue that this is a distinctive feature of GLBT consumers and queer spectatorship, is that we watch things that aren't intended for us and we find pleasure in them. So gays and lesbians maybe ignore endings of a film and only focus on the part that was positive, right? They don't focus on the part where the character, like Pretty in Pink, eventually gets a heterosexual romance. I'm just going to concentrate on this part where they seemed queer, right? So we can be thinking about this in a bifurcated way as you watch. Think about this and how a straight audience may have perceived this film in the 1980s, and then how would a queer spectator potentially approach this film? This is something that the documentary makers here are very interested in. And I had interviewed right before this class, and one interesting thing that came up in our discussion is just changing notions of masculinity. That is, what in the 1980s was considered all-American or wholesome would have been Jesse on screen, which today we would probably read as queer. So even the ideas about male performance, what was once considered all-American is probably today considered queer. These things change. Yeah.
This is definitely probably came out in the time with the whole masculinity movies of the Schwarzeneggers, the Stallones, like the male counterparts. But people don't really refer to Schwarzenegger or Stallone as queer or gay. So it's just it depends on how you think of it.
Yeah, deeply homosocial though, all those words. All right, so I think we're to keywords. Oh, so yeah. Right, our filmmakers. Just a reminder, you have one opportunity in this class for extra credit. That is to attend the talk tonight in Purdue Hall. I misspelled Purdue on that. It's Purdue with an E, 373. When you go, and I really want to support the filmmakers here today, so please attend, ask questions. They're here to talk about their experience of filmmaking, and I'm sure you guys all have things that you're passionate about. How do you translate that into a product? And how do you get it funded like they did, over $50,000 in 4 months? How can you do that? This is the current landscape of filmmaking, and they're here to speak to that.